Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that haunts the battlefields of the far future. It is not the whine of last fire cutting through smoke-choked air, nor the dull crump of artillery pounding hab blocks into rubble. It is something older than all of that, something more primal. It is the sound of a human voice stripped of reason, of language, of everything that separates a thinking being from a rabid animal. It is a scream that starts somewhere deep in the chest and tears its way upward, through the throat, until it becomes something shapeless and raw, a noise that carries across the killing ground like a physical force, freezing the blood of anyone unlucky enough to hear it. That sound belongs to the berserkers of Horn. They come in a tide of red and brass, their ancient power armor scarred and dented from 10,000 years of slaughter. Their helmets, crowned with the horned crests of their patron god, are splashed with blood that never seems to dry. In their gauntlets, they carry weapons that were designed for one purpose, and one purpose only: to get close enough to feel the spray of their enemy's lifeblood against their skin. Chain axes that roar and snarl with hungry teeth. Chainswords that buck and kick with every swing. Sometimes nothing more than their own armored fists, because when the red mist descends and the nails start biting, any weapon will do. The only thing that matters is the killing. These are not soldiers, not anymore. Whatever discipline, whatever tactical awareness, whatever flickering remnant of the warriors they once were, has been burned away by rage and faith and 10 millennia of unbroken violence. While they are living weapons in the service of a god who cares for nothing but blood and skulls, a deity whose only commandment is to kill and kill and kill again until the stars themselves run red. They are the Horn Berserkers, and in all the grim darkness of the far future, there is nothing more terrifying than watching them charge. But here is the thing about the Berserkers that most people miss when they first encounter them in the lore of Warhammer 40,000. They were not always like this. There was a time, long ago in the earliest days of the Imperium, when the warriors who would become these frothing engines of carnage were something entirely different. They were soldiers. They were brothers. They were the warhounds of the Emperor, and they fought with a savage discipline that made them the finest shock troops in the galaxy.
As their fall from grace is one of the most tragic stories in all of 40k, a tale of betrayal and broken promises, of a father who failed his sons and sons who were twisted beyond recognition by the very implants that were supposed to make them stronger. So settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we are going to walk a long and bloody road together, tracing the history of the Berserkers from the very beginning to the blood-soaked present. We are going to talk about the god they worship, the Primarch who damned them, the implants that stole their sanity, and the 10,000 years of unrelenting carnage that followed. We are going to talk about Khan the Betrayer and the night he shattered a legion.
Does about the first war for Armageddon and the demon Primarch who led 50,000 screaming madmen against the walls of an imperial hive world, about what it truly means to be a berserker in a galaxy that knows only war. This is a story about rage, about what happens when anger becomes worship, when violence becomes prayer, and when the line between warrior and weapon is erased forever. And like all the best stories in Warhammer 40,000, it begins with a god. To understand the Berserkers, you first have to understand the thing they serve. And to understand Khorne, you have to understand something fundamental about the way the warp works in the 40k universe. The warp, that roiling dimension of psychic energy that exists alongside real space, is not simply a void. It is alive in its own horrible way, as it is shaped by the emotions and experiences of every sentient being in the galaxy, fed by their fears and their desires, their hatreds and their loves. And when enough of a single emotion concentrates in that swirling chaos of psychic energy, when enough rage or pleasure or ambition or decay pools together in the immaterium, something coalesces, something wakes up, something that was always there, formless and sleeping, suddenly opens its eyes and begins to hunger. Horn was the first of these beings to fully awaken. The oldest of the 4 great chaos gods, Horn stirred into consciousness during what we would recognize as Terra's medieval period, an era of wars and conquests, of crusades and massacres that sent ripples of violence echoing through the warp. Every sword that was swung in anger, every army that marched to war, every act of murder committed in passion or cold calculation fed the growing consciousness of the blood god. He did not create violence. He was created by it. He is the reflection of every act of aggression that has ever been committed by a thinking being, the psychic residue of 10,000 years of galactic warfare, given form and will and an insatiable appetite for more. The name Khorne itself derives from the dark tongue of chaos, from the word Karneth, which translates roughly as Lord of Rage or Lord of Blood. And those titles tell you everything you need to know about his nature. Khorne is not subtle. He does not scheme like Tzeentch, does not seduce like Slaanesh, does not corrupt through slow decay like Nurgle. His philosophy is as blunt and direct as the axes his followers carry. Kill, maim, burn, blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. There are no complicated rituals required to worship Khorne, no sacred texts to memorize, no hidden mysteries to unravel. You worship Khorne by fighting, by killing, by offering up the blood of your enemies, and when your enemies run out, the blood of your allies, because Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it flows. Picture the domain of the blood god, if you can. Somewhere in the deepest reaches of the warp, beyond the reach of mortal understanding, there exists a realm of brass and bone. 8 enormous towers ring a fortress called the Brass Citadel, a monument to fury that echoes endlessly with the clash of weapons and the screams of the dying. Rivers of boiling blood wind through landscapes of volcanic rock and shattered bone. At the base of the citadel lie the blood pits, churning with the demonic energy that gives birth to Khorne's servants, the bloodletters and flesh hounds and bloodthirsters that form his endless legions. And at the very center of it all, atop a mountain of skulls that reaches higher than imagination can compass, sits a throne of brass. Upon that throne sits Khorne himself, a vast and terrible figure, clad in baroque armor, carved with writhing runes and screaming faces. His eyes burn with fury in the center of a savage, dog-like face. His voice, when he chooses to speak, is the sound of every weapon that has ever been drawn in anger, every bone that has ever been broken, every life that has ever been taken in rage. Every skull in that mountain was once a living being. Warriors and kings, generals and governors, heroes and cowards alike. At their skulls offered up to the blood god by his faithful servants across the breadth of the galaxy and the span of 10,000 years. Each one represents a life taken in Khorne's name, a small offering to the eternal hunger of the god who sits atop them. And the mountain never stops growing, because the killing never stops. Now here is something interesting about Khorne that often gets lost in the simplicity of his followers' war cries. Khorne is not merely the god of mindless slaughter, though mindless slaughter certainly pleases him. He is also, in a strange and terrible way, the god of martial honor. He values strength. He respects the warrior who faces a superior foe and refuses to back down. He looks favorably upon the champion who tests himself against the mightiest opponents and emerges victorious. As there is a code buried beneath all the blood and fury, a brutal meritocracy where the only currency that matters is skill at arms and the willingness to use it. Khorne despises weakness, cowardice, and deception. He loathes sorcery and the psychic arts, viewing them as the weapons of those too feeble to fight honestly. His hatred of Tzeentch, the chaos god of magic and manipulation, is legendary. His rivalry with Slaanesh, the god of excess and sensation, is even more intense, because Slaanesh represents everything Khorne finds contemptible: self-indulgence, decadence, the pursuit of pleasure rather than the honest struggle of combat. The number 8 is sacred to Khorne. though no one can say exactly why. Perhaps it has always been so, encoded into the fabric of the warp since the first act of violence rippled through the Imperium. His demonic legions, the Blood Legions, are organized into 8 cohorts. There are 8 classes of Bloodthirster, his greater demons, those massive bat-winged nightmares of muscle and fury that serve as his generals on the battlefield. Even the names of his demonic servants tend to fall into patterns of 8 syllables. His primary colors are blood red, black, and brass, and his symbol, the Mark of Khorne, is a jagged, angular thing that resembles a stylized skull or a figure 8, depending on how you look at it. When his followers carve this mark into their own flesh, it bleeds constantly, a never-ending offering to the god they serve. But Khorne is not without his own kind of generosity. The gifts he bestows upon his faithful are terrifying in their potency. A collar of Khorne, forged at the weapons foundries at the foot of the Skull Throne, can control the warp energy around its wearer and protect them from incoming psychic powers, turning the sorcery that Khorne so despises into a weapon that breaks against the necks of his servants like water against stone. A berserker glaive, containing the bound essence of a bloodthirster driven truly insane by captivity, provides devastating power in combat, though the weapon does not always destroy the intended target. Banners of Rage contain the souls of the most bloodthirsty of Khorne's followers and emit those emotions into the minds of those nearby, raising the appetite for killing to levels that would make an ordinary warrior tear out his own eyes in horror. Then there are the demons, the bloodletters, the rank and file of Khorne's infernal armies. With their bodies of living crimson muscle and their hellblades that burn with the fires of the warp. The flesh hounds, savage tracking beasts that can hunt a soul through the labyrinthine corridors of the Imperium itself. The blood crushers, terrifying fusion of bloodletter and juggernaut, a demonic beast of living brass and fury that shakes the ground with every thundering step. And towering above them all, the bloodthirsters, Khorne's greater demons, vast bat-winged nightmares of muscle and horn that are the most physically powerful demons in all of the warp. A single bloodthirster can lay waste to armies, and Khorne commands legions of them. The greatest of all bloodthirsters is Angrath the Unbound, a being of such apocalyptic power that it has only been summoned to the material universe twice in the last 10,000 years. The very mention of Angrath's name in certain imperial texts is enough to trigger automatic purging protocols. So dangerous is even the knowledge of this entity's existence. All of this, the skulls and the blood and the demons and the gifts, exists because Khorne is fed by a simple truth about the galaxy. There will always be war. In a universe where the forces of chaos press in from every angle, where alien empires threaten humanity's borders, and internal strife tears the Imperium apart from within, the blood will never stop flowing. Every last bolt that finds its target, every blade that opens a throat, every shell that reduces a body to its component elements adds a fraction of power to the blood god's already unfathomable might. Khorne does not need to recruit followers. The galaxy provides them without being asked. And understanding Khorne is essential to understanding the Berserkers, because the Berserkers are, in the most literal sense, his perfect worshippers. Everything they are, everything they do, every life they take, and every drop of blood they spill is an act of devotion to the blood god. They have surrendered everything else, their identities, their sanity, their futures, in exchange for the purity of rage and the terrible clarity that comes with it. When a berserker charges across a battlefield with his chain axe screaming and his voice raised in that inhuman howl, he is not merely fighting, he is praying. And Khorne, sitting upon his throne of skulls in the heart of the warp, is listening. But the berserkers did not simply appear out of nowhere, fully formed and frothing with rage. They were made, and forged in the crucible of one of the most tragic stories the galaxy has ever known. And that story begins not with a god, but with a legion. Long before there were berserkers, before the blood and the fury and the 10,000 years of unrelenting slaughter, there was a legion of space marines who bore a different name and served a very different purpose. They were called the Warhounds, and they were the 12th legion of the Emperor's Legiones Astartes, created during the late 30th millennium as part of humanity's greatest military undertaking, the Great Crusade. The origins of the 12th Legion are murky, as are the origins of many of the original 20 Space Marine legions. What is known is that the Emperor of Mankind, the immortal psychic ruler of humanity, created the Legions Astartes from the genetic material of 20 extraordinary beings called the Primarchs, each one a superhuman of almost godlike power who was intended to serve as both general and exemplar for his respective legion. The Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods before they could be united with their legions, and so the early legions were raised and trained on Terra, humanity's homeworld, without the guiding presence of their genetic fathers. The Warhounds were formed from recruits drawn from across Terra's various techno-barbarian tribes and city-states. There is some evidence to suggest that a psychological screening process was used in their selection, one that deliberately sought out the most inherently aggressive and competitive candidates. If this is true, as then from the very beginning, the 12th Legion was designed to be something savage, something barely controlled, the Emperor's own weapon of last resort, kept in reserve for situations where subtlety was pointless, and only the most overwhelming application of violence would suffice. It was the Emperor himself who supposedly gave the 12th Legion their first name. The story goes that he dubbed them his Warhounds, after watching them pacify the narco-sprawls of the Sephic hives during the Unification Wars, impressed by the savage and tenacious way they fought. The Red Hound became their symbol, and with it came a reputation that spread across the battlefields of the early Imperium. The Warhounds were the troops you sent when you needed something dead, not contained, not negotiated with, dead. Their first recorded engagement was during the Saafric liberation of the Unification Wars, where they served as a spearhead of shock troops, mounting direct annihilation assaults on enemy forces in both open battle and fortified positions. Despite their relatively small numbers at the time, they carried the attack through sheer courage and the fury of the violence they could unleash. This set the pattern for everything that would follow. The Warhounds were not a precision instrument. They were a sledgehammer, and the Emperor wielded them accordingly. When the Great Crusade kicked off and the legions were unleashed upon the galaxy to bring the scattered worlds of humanity back under Imperial control, the Warhounds became expert shock troops. The largest concentration of their forces, some 8,000 strong, along with dedicated assault and fleet support elements, was designated the 13th Expeditionary Fleet. It quickly earned the nickname the Bloody 13th because wherever it went, blood followed. The Warhounds were deployed as a mobile reserve, sent to the most desperate battlefronts where an impasse had been reached, tasked with breaking strategic deadlocks through the sheer, unstoppable fury of their assaults. They served alongside other legions in glorious campaigns. The Space Wolves, the Iron Warriors, the Dark Angels, all fought beside the Warhounds at various points during the early Crusade. And while no one would have called the 12th Legion disciplined in the conventional sense, there was a savage efficiency to their methods that produced results. Yet worlds that might have held out for months or years against a more methodical siege fell in hours when the Warhounds were unleashed. Their casualty rates were high, shockingly high by the standards of most other legions, but their recruitment rates matched them, and the bodies they left behind were always outnumbered by the bodies of their enemies. But there was a darkness lurking beneath the surface of the Warhounds even in those early days. Their temper was legendary. Discipline was maintained only through an especially harsh code of conduct, and even then, intersign rivalries and clashes were alarmingly common. Stories circulated of human auxiliary regiments being put to the sword alongside the enemy if they failed to keep pace with the Warhounds' advance. The 12th Legion was effective, undeniably so, but they were also dangerous in a way that made Imperial command increasingly uncomfortable. They were used more and more as a blunt instrument, pointed at targets that needed to be obliterated with no concern for collateral damage
or the finer points of strategy. The Primarch Sanguinius of the Blood Angels once described the forces that accompanied the Warhounds as a carnival of monsters, a collection of the most degenerate and brutish elements of the Imperial military, from the Numan gun clans to the notoriously violent Legio Audax Titan Legion. It was, Sanguinius suggested, a force assembled for the Emperor's own amusement, though the Blood Angel conceded that he doubted whoever the Emperor unleashed them upon would see the jest. And then the Emperor found his Red Angel, and everything changed. But before we get to Angron, and it is worth pausing to consider what the Warhounds were on the eve of their Primarch's discovery. They were a legion of approximately 150,000 Space Marines at their peak, a formidable force by any measure. Their organizational structure was relatively simple, their chain of command streamlined and direct, reflecting the pragmatic approach to warfare that had defined them since their earliest days on Terra. They did not go in for the elaborate hierarchies and ceremonial titles that characterize some of the other legions. Their commanders earned their rank through demonstrated combat ability, and they kept it through continued performance. It was a meritocracy of violence, and in its own savage way, it worked. The Warhounds had their own traditions, their own rituals, yet their own particular way of approaching the business of making war. They fought in close-ranked assault formations that emphasized speed and shock, crashing into enemy lines with a fury that broke morale before it broke bodies. They used heavy assault units, terminators and specialized squads as the spearhead of their attacks, followed by waves of tactical and close assault troops that exploited the gaps torn in the enemy's defenses. It was not elegant, but it was devastatingly effective. They also had something that is often forgotten in the later narrative of Blood and Madness: honor. A rough, blunt, uncomplicated sort of honor, to be sure, but honor nonetheless. The Warhounds respected courage and despised cowardice. They admired enemies who fought bravely and felt nothing but contempt for those who surrendered without a fight. There was a code embedded in their culture, a set of unspoken rules about how warriors should conduct themselves, that had evolved naturally over decades of shared service and shared sacrifice. All of this would be swept away when Angron took command. The traditions, the honor code, the organizational structures that had served the Warhounds for decades, all of it would be dismantled and replaced by the gladiatorial savagery of Nuceria. But for one brief moment in the long and bloody history of the 12th Legion, there existed a force of warriors who were fierce without being monstrous, savage without being insane, violent without being lost. The Warhounds were the last, best hope of the Legion that would become the World Eaters. And they never even knew it. The story of Angron is, without exaggeration, one of the saddest tales in all of Warhammer 40,000. It is a story about a man who was broken before he ever had a chance to be whole. A being of godlike potential who was mutilated and enslaved, and then, when he finally found the will to fight back against his tormentors, was stolen from the only people who had ever given him a sense of belonging. Every terrible thing that the World Eaters would eventually become, every scream and every skull and every river of blood, can be traced back to what was done to Angron on the world of Nuceria, and what was done to him afterward by the Emperor of Mankind. When the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by the Chaos Gods, the infant who would become Angron crashed into the mountains of a world called Nuceria. It was a civilized world, technologically advanced, but its civilization was built on a foundation of cruelty. Nuceria was ruled by an aristocratic class called the High Riders, and their favorite entertainment was watching slaves fight and die in gladiatorial arenas. The young Primarch was found by slavers, and, recognizing that they had discovered something extraordinary, they did not kill him. Instead, they did something far worse. They put him in the pits. The gladiatorial arenas of Nuceria were places of systematic dehumanization. Slaves were modified with cybernetic implants, their bodies altered and augmented to make them more effective fighters for the amusement of the crowds. Arms were replaced with hooks or blades.
Chemical glands were implanted to boost aggression and pain tolerance. Some slaves were subjected to glanding, or a process that flooded their bodies with combat stimulants that left them shaking and hollow when the effects wore off. Others had their arms removed entirely and replaced with crude weapon prosthetics, blades or hooks that could never be put down, that made the slave into something that could only fight and could never hold another human being or perform any act of gentleness or comfort. The arenas were designed to strip the humanity from their occupants piece by piece, turning living beings into spectacles of cruelty for the entertainment of the crowds who watched from their gilded seats above. But the most terrible modification of all was a device called the butcher's nails. The butcher's nails were a form of archaeotech, relics from the dark age of technology that had survived on Nuceria in a degraded and imperfectly understood form. They were cortical implants, crude neural devices that were hammered directly into the skull and surgically grafted to the cerebral cortex. What they did was devastatingly simple. They rewired the brain's reward pathways, making aggression and violence the only source of pleasure or relief from pain. With the nails active, a warrior experienced constant, grinding agony whenever they were not fighting. The only respite, the only moment of peace, came when the adrenaline was flowing and the blood was spilling. The nails punished calm and rewarded fury. They turned pain into rage, and rage into the only thing that felt like being alive. The slavers implanted the young Angron with the butcher's nails as punishment after he refused to fight another gladiator to the death. The implants were driven into his skull, as cables trailing from the insertion points like metallic dreadlocks, digging into his brain and reshaping its chemistry with every passing day. From that moment forward, Angron knew nothing but suffering. Every moment of quiet was agony. Every second between fights was a torment worse than anything his captors could have inflicted with whips or brands. The only mercy was the arena, the brief, blood-soaked respite of combat, where the nails would flood his synapses with electrochemical pleasure and, for a few precious minutes, the pain would stop. But Angron was a Primarch, even broken and enslaved, even with archaeotech parasites burrowing into his brain. He was something more than human. He was smarter than his captors realized, stronger than they could control, and possessed of an indomitable will that refused to accept the chains they had placed upon him. He began to plot his escape. He built alliances among his fellow slaves, men and women who had suffered as he had suffered, who bore their own scars and implants and harbored their own desperate dreams of freedom. And when the time was right, Angron led them in a rebellion that shook Nuceria to its foundations. His army of freed slaves, who came to be known as the Eaters of Cities for the sheer destruction they wrought, carved a path of liberation across the planet. They fought with a fury born of desperation and righteous anger, defeating every army the High Riders sent against them, despite being outgunned, outnumbered, and equipped with nothing more than salvaged weapons and the crude implements of the arena. Angron's tactical instincts, even degraded by the nails, were those of a Primarch. He understood terrain, supply lines, force disposition, and the crucial importance of morale in a way that his slave-driving opponents could never match. His warriors loved him, not because he was kind or gentle, for the nails made such qualities impossible, but because he fought beside them rather than above them. He bled with them. He suffered with them. He was one of them, the first among equals in a brotherhood forged in the fires of shared torment. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Angron might actually win. That the slave who had been broken in the pits might somehow break the chains of an entire world. Victory after victory added to the legend of the Eaters of Cities, and slaves from across Nuceria flocked to Angron's banner, swelling the ranks of his rebellion until it threatened the very foundations of the High Riders' power. But it was not to be. The High Riders gathered their forces, marshalling 5 full armies to crush the rebellion once and for all. Angron and his remaining followers, numbering perhaps 1,000, found themselves cornered in the mountains at a place called Deshelica Ridge. There was no escape, no reinforcements, no hope. And so Angron made the only decision that made sense to a man who had been denied everything except the right to choose how he would die. He ordered his warriors to dig their own graves, a signal to the approaching armies that no quarter would be asked and none was expected. They would fight to the last, and they would die free. Then the Emperor arrived. Far above in orbit, the master of mankind had been watching. But he had observed Angron's rebellion with interest, perhaps even with pride, recognizing in the slave gladiator the genetic legacy of one of his lost sons. But the Emperor had not come to help Angron fight. He had come to claim him. Descending to the surface with a guard of custodians, the Emperor offered Angron what he believed was an extraordinary gift: command of the 12th Legion, a place at his side, and a role in the Great Crusade that would unite humanity under a single banner. Angron refused. He would not abandon his brothers and sisters on the eve of their final battle. He had promised to die with them, and that was exactly what he intended to do. The Emperor, apparently surprised by this rejection, tried to persuade his son. When persuasion failed, yet the Emperor made a decision that would echo through the next 10,000 years of galactic history. He ordered Angron teleported from the battlefield against his will, spiriting him away to the Warhounds' flagship, while the battle at Deshelika Ridge raged on below. Angron watched from orbit as his brothers and sisters were slaughtered, every single one of them, the men and women who had fought beside him, who had trusted him, who had dug their own graves in the certainty that their leader would stand beside them in the end, were butchered while Angron screamed and raged in the holds of an unfamiliar ship, surrounded by warriors he did not know and did not want. This was the wound that would never heal. This was the betrayal that would fester and corrupt everything it touched for the next 10 millennia. The Emperor had saved Angron's life, but in doing so, he had destroyed something far more important. He had destroyed the only man Angron could have been, the leader, the liberator, the warrior who chose to die free rather than live in chains. What remained was a broken thing, consumed by grief and rage and the constant, gnawing agony of the butcher's nails. A ghost, as Angron himself would later say to the Emperor's face. Nothing but a ghost, wearing the shape of a man who died on Nuceria. The Emperor's response was chilling in its pragmatism. A ghost would suffice, he said, for what he had planned. The meeting between Angron and his legion was unlike any other union of Primarch and Space Marines in the history of the Imperium. Where other Primarchs had been welcomed by their legions with ceremony and celebration, and Angron's first contact with the Warhounds was an exercise in pure, unrestrained violence. Lost in an inconsolable rage over what had just happened to him, driven to the edge of madness by grief and the constant bite of the butcher's nails, Angron killed every officer of the Warhounds who attempted to speak with him. He started with the Legion Master, a respected commander named Ibram Greer, who had led the 12th Legion for nearly 3 decades. Greer approached his Primarch with all the deference and ceremony appropriate to such a meeting. Angron killed him. The next officer in the chain of command came forward. Angron killed him too, and the next, and the next. The Warhounds officers attempted to reach their Primarch in order of seniority, and as each one approached, the senior cadre of the Legion diminished further. It was Captain Hahn of the 8th Assault Company who finally managed to break through. Exactly how Khan accomplished what so many others had died attempting remains a matter of some debate. Some accounts suggest that Khan spoke to Angron about the rituals of the Nucerian gladiators, drawing parallels between the traditions of the arena and the martial culture of the Warhounds. Others suggest that Khan simply proved tough enough to survive being in the same room as an enraged Primarch, and that his stubborn refusal to die earned him Angron's grudging respect. Whatever the truth, Khan was able to forge a tenuous bond with Angron, becoming his equerry, his right hand, and perhaps the closest thing to a friend that the Red Angel would ever have. When Angron finally emerged from his quarters, ready and somewhat willing to assume command of his legion, Khan, introduced him to the surviving officers with a simple phrase: "Salute, the one whose strength makes us brothers." The warhounds saluted. And then everything began to change. Angron renamed the legion almost immediately. A captain named Dregger, one of the Terran-born warhounds, promised the Primarch that under his leadership, the warhounds would become the Eaters of Worlds. The name stuck. The warhounds became the World Eaters, and with that new name came a transformation that would take the 12th Legion from savage but effective shock troops to something altogether more dangerous. Whatever Terran martial traditions had existed within the warhounds were systematically erased and replaced by Angron's own gladiatorial code. Training was no longer separate from warfare. Our blood, live rounds, bared blades, fighting pits, gladiatorial combat. These became the methods by which the World Eaters tested themselves. Each warrior bore scars that counted the lessons learned amid heat and bitter volcanic sand, and those who failed did not live long enough to try again.
Now, I want to take a quick moment here to share something personal, because this part of the lore is what actually got me hooked on the World Eaters in the first place. When I first read about Angron being ripped away from his brothers on Nuceria, that moment genuinely changed how I saw this entire faction. Before that, I just thought they were the angry guys with chain axes, which, fair enough, they are. But that one detail, the Emperor pulling his own son away from the people he actually loved, forcing him to watch them die from orbit, that reframes everything. Every single berserker charging across a battlefield in the 41st millennium is a downstream consequence of that one decision. One father's cruelty echoing across 10,000 years. And I think this is what makes the World Eaters the most tragic faction in all of 40k. And honestly, it's not even close. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
Angron demanded that his legion bring worlds to compliance within 31 hours, the span of a single Nucerian day, the same amount of time it had taken his army of freed slaves to score their greatest victory. When the World Eaters failed to meet this deadline, Angron ordered decimation. 1 in every 10 legionaries was killed by his 9 brothers as punishment. And then Angron made the decision that would seal the fate of his legion forever. And he ordered his apothecarian to replicate the butcher's nails and implant them into the brains of every World Eater. The butcher's nails were never meant to be replicated. The originals were archaeotech from the dark age of technology, relics of a lost era whose principles were only dimly understood by the tech priests and apothecaries who examined them. Angron's own implants had been studied by the Archmagos Veneratus of the 12th Legion, a tech priest named Vel Keradar, who spent 7 hours examining the crude neural devices hammered into the Primarch's skull. What he found was deeply troubling. The nails had remapped Angron's brain. They had reduced his lifespan, degraded his tactical acumen, and restructured his neural pathways so fundamentally that removing them would be fatal. The Primarch was, in the most literal sense, a slave to the implants. They were killing him by degrees, burning through his neural tissue like slow acid, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Despite this knowledge, despite the Emperor's own orders prohibiting the use of the nails, Angron demanded that his legion undergo the same procedure. Under the supervision of an apothecary named Garland Surlac, the World Eater's apothecarian began the grim work of replicating the butcher's nails and implanting them into the brains of Angron's sons. The early attempts were catastrophic. The first copies of the nails produced a 100% mortality rate among the Astartes volunteers. Every single one died on the operating table, their enhanced physiologies unable to cope with the crude neural rewiring that the implants demanded. But Angron persisted. And he demanded that the process continue, that his apothecaries refine their techniques until the implantation could be achieved without killing the subject. And over time, through trial and error and the deaths of an unknown number of World Eaters who volunteered to be test subjects, they succeeded. The perfected copies of the butcher's nails were not identical to Angron's originals. They were cruder, in some ways even more destructive, but they worked. They rewired the brain's pain and pleasure centers, just as the Nucerian originals had done, punishing calm and rewarding violence. turning every moment of peace into suffering and every moment of combat into ecstasy. It is important to understand what the butcher's nails actually do to a space marine's mind, because this is the mechanism by which ordinary warriors are transformed into berserkers. The implants work by hijacking the brain's limbic system, the ancient, primal architecture that governs emotion and motivation. Under normal circumstances, a human brain, even the enhanced brain of a space marine, experiences a range of emotions and motivations. Fear, joy, sorrow, curiosity, compassion, all of these impulses compete for attention and influence behavior in complex ways. The butcher's nails simplify this system with terrifying efficiency. They suppress everything except aggression. They dull the capacity for empathy, for reflection, for any emotional response that does not directly serve the purpose of combat. And they replace these suppressed impulses with a single overwhelming drive, the need to kill. A space marine with the nails implanted experiences the world in fundamentally altered terms. In moments of calm, the nails inflict constant grinding pain, a headache that never ends, a buzzing in the back of the skull that makes concentration nearly impossible and drives the afflicted warrior toward increasing irritability and aggression. The only relief comes when the marine is fighting. When the adrenaline starts flowing and the weapons are drawn, the nails respond with surges of electrochemical pleasure that flood the brain with a sensation that has been compared to pure, distilled euphoria. For a brief, beautiful moment, the pain stops. Everything becomes clear. The world narrows to the simple, perfect equation of weapon meeting flesh, and the marine feels more alive than he has ever felt in his life. And then the fight ends. As the enemy falls, the euphoria fades, and the pain comes rushing back worse than before, because the brain has now been conditioned to associate peace with suffering and violence with relief. The cycle feeds on itself, each round of combat raising the baseline of pain that the marine experiences between fights, each kill making the hunger for the next kill that much more desperate. Over time, the nails erode the marine's capacity for rational thought, stripping away higher cognitive functions and leaving nothing but the raw animal imperative to fight and kill. The end result is a being that is still technically alive, still technically conscious, but functionally little more than a weapon that happens to possess the remnants of a human mind. This is what Angron inflicted upon his entire legion. This is the gift he gave to his sons, born of his own suffering and his own inability to conceive of a world where pain was not the baseline of existence. He had been enslaved by the nails since childhood, and in his broken way, he believed that sharing them with his warriors was an act of communion rather than cruelty. If they bore the same pain, they would understand him. If they knew the same rage, they would be true brothers in a way that genetics alone could never achieve. Some within the legion resisted. A centurion named Mago led a rebellion against the implantation program, recognizing the nails for what they were, not a gift, but a curse, not a path to brotherhood, but a road to damnation. Mago's revolt was crushed by Khan, who killed the rebel centurion in combat, while Angron himself slaughtered a young librarian named Tethys, who had attempted to heal the Primarch's tortured mind. With the opposition silenced, the implantation program proceeded without further resistance. Every World Eater received the nails. Every World Eater became, to one degree or another, a slave to the same rage that had consumed their father. The effects were immediate and devastating. The legion that had once been savage but effective became savage and increasingly uncontrollable. The World Eaters' already high casualty rates climbed even higher as their tactical discipline eroded under the constant pressure of the nails. Their Librarius, the psychic division that maintained whatever thin thread of psychic capability the Legion possessed, was destroyed when it was discovered that the Butcher's nails were incompatible with psychic talents. The implants killed psychers outright, or drove them into violent psychotic breaks that endangered everyone around them. The last of the World Eater's librarians would be slaughtered by Angron himself during his ascension to daemonhood on Nuceria.
a final act of spiritual cleansing that pleased Khorne immensely, for the blood god would not brook the existence of psychers among his chosen servants. Other Primarchs noticed the change in the 12th Legion and spoke out against it. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves confronted Angron directly, bringing word that the Emperor wanted the World Eaters to cease the implantation program and to stop their increasingly indiscriminate massacres. The confrontation led to a brief but bloody clash between the Space Wolves and the World Eaters in an event known as the Night of the Wolf. Angron bested Russ in single combat, but failed to realize that he had been outmaneuvered tactically, allowing himself to become surrounded by Space Wolves who could have killed him at any time. Russ withdrew, having made his point, but the lesson was lost on Angron. The nails stayed, the killing continued, and the World Eaters slid further down the path that would lead them to Khorne. Robut Guilliman of the Ultramarines decried the atrocities committed by Angron's legion during the cleansing of Aragata, where the World Eaters had butchered a compliant population alongside the enemy combatants they had been sent to destroy. But Guilliman's protests, like those of Russ, fell on ears that were deaf to anything except the buzzing of the nails and the siren call of violence. By the time the Great Crusade reached its final years, the World Eaters had been transformed into something that the Emperor had never intended. They were not soldiers anymore. They were weapons, pointed at targets and unleashed with the understanding that whatever was in their path would be destroyed, friend and foe alike. And then the Horus Heresy began, and everything got worse. When Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium and favored son of the Emperor, turned against his father and ignited the galaxy-spanning civil war known as the Horus Heresy, it surprised exactly no one that Angron and his World Eaters were among the first to join the rebellion. Angron had never loved the Emperor. How could he? The Master of Mankind had stolen him from the only people who had ever shown him loyalty, had condemned his brothers and sisters to die at Deshalika Ridge while he watched helplessly from orbit. The Emperor was just another master, another slaver, another figure of authority who used Angron for his own purposes and discarded the things he cared about. Horus simply offered what Angron had always wanted: the freedom to unleash his rage without restraint, to kill without the pretense of serving some higher purpose, to burn the galaxy down because it deserved to burn. The World Eaters' participation in the Horus Heresy was marked by escalating violence and an increasingly complete surrender to the influence of the Chaos God Khorne. This process did not happen overnight. In the early stages of the Heresy, the World Eaters were still recognizable as Space Marines, albeit exceptionally brutal ones. They fought at Istvan III, where the traitor legions turned on their own loyalist elements in a bloody purge that set the tone for everything that would follow. On Istvan III, the World Eaters who had remained loyal to the Emperor were subjected to betrayal by their own brothers, gunned down and bombed from orbit in a massacre that was designed to cleanse the traitor legions of any warriors whose loyalty might waver. It was here that Khan himself was nearly killed, struck down by Garviel Loken of the Lunar Wolves and impaled upon the dozer blades of a vehicle. He was believed dead, but death, it seemed, was not yet ready to claim the future betrayer. They fought at Istvan V, the drop site massacre, where 3 loyal legions, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard and the Iron Hands, were lured into a trap and nearly destroyed. The scale of the slaughter at Istvan V was staggering. Tens of thousands of loyalist Space Marines cut down in a killing ground designed by Horus himself, and the World Eaters reveled in it. The nails sang with every kill, and the warriors of the 12th Legion began to feel something they had never felt before: the touch of a god. Khorne was watching. Khorne was pleased. And with every skull that was taken, with every litany of blood that was screamed across the killing fields of Istvan V, the chains that bound the World Eaters to their patron tightened a little more. After Istvan, the World Eaters rampaged across the galaxy with a brutality that shocked even their fellow traitors. They sacked the Ultramarines' armory world of Armatura, or reducing a center of military industry to a charnel house. They butchered the populations of world after world in Ultramar,
during the Shadow Crusade, each massacre feeding both the growing ruin storm and the insatiable appetite of the blood god. The line between tactical operation and ritualized slaughter blurred and eventually disappeared entirely. The World Eaters were no longer fighting a civil war. They were conducting a galaxy-spanning act of worship, and every life they took was a prayer offered to the god of blood and skulls. And in each of these battles, the nails bit a little deeper, the rage burned a little hotter, and the World Eaters slipped a little further from anything resembling discipline or restraint. But the true turning point, at the moment when the World Eaters crossed the line between traitor space marines and something far worse, came during the Shadow Crusade. This was a joint military campaign conducted in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, where Angron and his World Eaters were paired with Lorgar Aurelian and his Word-Bearers to attack the realm of Ultramar, the stellar empire of Rebute Guilliman and his Ultramarines. The Shadow Crusade was, on its surface, a strategic operation designed to divert Guilliman's attention while Horus marshaled his forces for the drive on Terra. But Lorgar had a second, hidden purpose, one that would determine the fate of Angron and every World Eater who carried the Butcher's nails. Lorgar could see what others could not, or would not. The Butcher's nails were killing Angron. Slowly, agonizingly. But the Archaeotech parasites were burning through the Primarch's neural tissue, degrading his mind, and eroding whatever remained of the man he had been before the pits of Nuceria. Lorgar estimated that without intervention, Angron would die, his brain simply consumed by the very implants that defined his existence. And Lorgar, in his own twisted way, cared about his brother. He wanted to save him. The method he chose, however, was nothing short of damnation. The two Primarchs and their legions rampaged through Ultramar, destroying over 100 worlds and killing billions. The Shadow Crusade was a symphony of destruction that served both Horus's strategic goals and Lorgar's sorcerous ambitions, because each world that burned, each life that was taken, contributed to the creation of the Ruin Storm, a massive warp storm that would divide the galaxy in half and prevent the Loyalist legions from reinforcing Terra. Eventually, Lorgar guided Angron back to Nuceria. The Word-Bearer Primarch told his brother that returning to his homeworld might provide closure, perhaps even a way to overcome the Butcher's nails. But when the two Primarchs arrived, they discovered that the High Riders who had enslaved Angron were still in power, still ruling from their seats of privilege, still telling the populace that Angron had been a coward who had fled from the final battle at Deshalika Ridge. The truth had been erased. Angron's brothers and sisters, the warriors who had died in his name, had been written out of history. Something inside Angron broke completely. Whatever remnant of reason, of restraint, or of anything resembling self-control had survived the nails and the heresy, and the 10,000 small cruelties of his existence was shattered by the discovery that his martyred comrades had been dishonored in death. He ordered the World Eaters and the Word-Bearers to purge Nuceria of its entire population. Every man, woman, and child, every city, every settlement, every living thing on the planet that had tormented him. And while the slaughter raged, while the rivers ran red and the mountains shook with the fury of two Space Marine legions unleashed without mercy, Lorgar enacted his hidden plan, using Angron's boundless rage as a conduit, channeling the psychic energy of 100 murdered worlds through rituals performed in the dark tongue of chaos. Lorgar called upon the blood god Horn to claim his brother. As the warp tore open above Nuceria, raining blood upon the battlefield, as the barrier between real space and the Imperium dissolved. Angron's body was racked with spasms as the power of Horn surged through him, transforming his blood to quicksilver, then to lava, then to holy fire. His flesh twisted and expanded, bones cracking and reforming, muscles swelling to inhuman proportions as the essence of the blood god remade him in its own terrible image. 19 World Eater librarians, the last psychers in the 12th Legion, attempted to prevent their Primarch's transformation. They formed a psychic gestalt, pulling at Angron's soul from one direction, while Lorgar and the demons he had summoned pulled from the other. It was a tug of war over the fate of a Primarch, fought on the border between reality and the warp. Lorgar won. Yet the librarians were destroyed, their psychic talents snuffed out like candles in a hurricane, and Angron completed his ascension. What emerged from the fires of Nuceria was no longer a Primarch in any recognizable sense. Angron had become a demon prince of Khorne, a towering nightmare of brass and fury, his once human features twisted into something monstrous, his body a vessel for the endless rage of the blood god. The butcher's nails, which had been killing him by degrees for decades, were subsumed into his new demonic form, their torment now a permanent feature of his existence rather than a countdown to death. Lorgar believed he had saved his brother. In Angron's mind, he had been damned. The first words the newly ascended Angron spoke were a command to Khan: massacre the slaves in the lower decks of the Conqueror and build him a skull throne. The World Eaters, watching their father's transformation in horror and awe, could feel the pull of Khorne through the bond they shared with their Primarch. The Blood God had claimed the Red Angel, and through him, he had claimed his legion. The World Eater's path was now set in brass and sealed in blood. They would serve Khorne, now and forever, and their only sacrament would be slaughter. Lorgar had offered up the 12th Legion to the whims of the Blood God as his loyal champions. From that day forward, there would only be blood for them, an ocean of blood, carried on a tide of eternal slaughter. The Siege of Terra was the culmination of everything the Horus Heresy had been building toward. It was the final confrontation between the forces of the War Master and the defenders of the Imperium, fought upon the surface of humanity's birth world, in the shadow of the Imperial Palace itself. Every traitor legion contributed to the assault, but none fought with the mindless, unstoppable fury of the World Eaters. By the time the siege began, the World Eaters had given full vent to their most destructive urges. They were no longer soldiers in any meaningful sense of the word. They were berserkers, blood-soaked and frothing with rage, their minds consumed by the butcher's nails and the corrupting influence of Khorne. Any reason that had survived the implantation process and the long years of the heresy had been driven from their heads, but replaced by the singular will of the Blood God. Angron himself, now a towering demon prince, was barely controllable. It took all the firepower that Perturabo of the Iron Warriors could muster to get him to the Sol system in time for the siege, and even then, Angron's obedience to Horus's battle plan was tenuous at best. On Terra itself, the World Eaters were unleashed like a force of nature. They tore across the planet, slaughtering friends and foes alike, their advance marked by a trail of destruction that had no strategic purpose whatsoever. They were not trying to capture objectives or secure territory. They were simply killing everything in their path, driven by an imperative that had nothing to do with Horus's goals and everything to do with the insatiable hunger of the god they now served. The Emperor's psychic barrier, or projected from the Golden Throne, kept the newly ascended Angron from entering the Imperial Palace itself. But this did not stop the demon Primarch from battering at the walls and their unfortunate defenders with tireless demonic fury. The World Eaters led the assault upon the walls of the Imperial Palace, taking the breach at the Lion's Gate with no regard for their own losses. Khan was at the forefront of every attack, his chain-axe Gorechild screaming as it bit into the armor of loyalist space marines. A kill counter installed in the lens of his helmet, a gift from Horus himself, clicked steadily upward as the bodies piled around him. It is said that Khan killed 1 million of the Emperor's servants during the siege, a tally that has never been surpassed by any mortal champion of Khorne. During the final hours of the siege, the World Eaters were an uncontrollable mob, no longer responsive to any authority except the driving imperative of the nails. The traitor Imperial army forces around them had degraded into gibbering cultists. The Sons of Horus were the only organized force still fighting in the War Master's name. But the World Eaters did not need organization. They did not need orders. They had the nails, and the nails had only one command. When the Emperor finally defeated Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit,
and the forces of chaos were routed, the World Eaters were the last to leave the field. They did not retreat because they had been defeated. They retreated because there was no one left to kill. Khan himself was found lying upon a mound of corpses at the walls of the inner palace, his body broken and mangled beyond recognition. His fellow World Eaters carried his remains to the dropships, and it was only aboard the retreating vessels that they discovered, to their shock and perhaps to their horror, that the captain still lived. Whether Horn breathed life back into his favored champion, or whether Khan's own relentless spirit simply refused to depart, remains a mystery. But from that day forward, Khan would be protected by the supernatural favor of the blood god. He would survive wounds that should have killed him 1,000 times over, rising from the dead like a blood-soaked revenant to continue his endless harvest of skulls. The Siege of Terra was over. The Horus Heresy had ended in defeat for the traitors. But for the World Eaters and their patron god, the war was just beginning. The aftermath of the Horus Heresy saw the traitor legions driven from the Sol system and hounded across the galaxy during a period known as the Great Scouring. The surviving traitors fled toward the Eye of Terror, a permanent wound in the fabric of reality where the warp bled into real space, creating a region of demonic activity and twisted physics that served as a refuge for the damned. The World Eaters fled with the rest, but their flight was unlike that of the other traitor legions. Where the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, and the others maintained at least some semblance of organizational structure during their retreat, the World Eaters were already coming apart at the seams. The problem was simple and insoluble. The Butcher's Nails demanded violence, and without external enemies to fight, the World Eaters turned on each other. Intersign conflicts erupted throughout the Legion, as battle brothers driven to the edge of madness by the constant pain of the nails lashed out at anyone within reach. Warbands fought warbands. Companies battled companies. The chain of command, already strained to the breaking point by years of Heresy-era carnage, dissolved entirely as the Legion's most aggressive elements killed their way to the top of whatever hierarchy remained. It was Khan who attempted to impose some measure of order on this chaos. Having recovered from his near-death experience at the walls of the Imperial Palace, the former equerry to Angron found himself looked to as a leader by those World Eaters who still possessed enough clarity to recognize the need for one. Angron himself had ascended to demonhood and was no longer a constant presence, his demonic form existing partly in the warp and incapable of maintaining a sustained physical presence in real space. The Legion needed a champion, and Khan, the first World Eater to survive the implantation of the Butcher's Nails, the hero of 100 battles, the warrior with the highest kill count in the history of the Blood God's mortal servants, was the obvious choice. Khan's first priority was finding a home for the World Eaters within the Eye of Terror, a base of operations from which they could rebuild their strength and strike back at the hated Imperium. His search led them to the demon world of Scalithrax, a cursed planet once inhabited by the ancient Eldari before their civilization collapsed. Scalithrax was a world of extremes, its surface alternating between periods of tolerable warmth and nights of such profound, bone-cracking cold that even a space marine in full power armor could be killed in minutes by the plummeting temperatures. The World Eaters were not the only ones who had found Scalithrax. The Emperor's children, the legion of the chaos god Slaanesh, had also claimed the world, drawn by the ancient Eldari soulstones that littered its surface and the debased pleasures they represented. It was not long before the two traitor legions were fighting each other for control of the planet, and the resulting battle became one of the most consequential engagements in the 10,000-year history of the Long War. The fighting between the World Eaters and the Emperor's children raged for an entire day. The World Eaters, in their element in brutal close-quarters combat, pushed the followers of Slaanesh back through the ruins of ancient Eldari cities, carving a bloody path through enemy lines with chain axe and chainsword.
Victory seemed within reach. One more push, one more charge, and Scalithrax would belong to the sons of Angron. Then the night came. Scalithrax's nights were legendary for their lethality. Temperatures plunged so dramatically that the very air seemed to crystallize, and the cold could kill even a superhuman warrior in a matter of moments during the deepest hours of darkness. Both legions recognized the danger and agreed to a temporary ceasefire, retreating to whatever shelters they could find to wait out the deadly night. The World Eaters huddled in the ruins of shattered buildings, their armor crusted with blood and ice, their breath forming clouds of frozen vapor in the rapidly dropping temperature. Khan would not have it. To the champion of Khorne, the ceasefire was an abomination. The World Eaters were on the verge of victory, and they were stopping to rest, to hide from the cold like frightened animals. Khan had stood upon the walls of the Imperial Palace and killed 1 million of the Emperor's servants. He had been the last to be carried from the battlefield of Terra. He had survived death itself through the favor of the Blood God. And now, his brothers wanted to stop fighting because of the weather? The fury that consumed Khan in that moment was something beyond even the ordinary rage of a World Eater driven by the butcher's nails. It was a cold, calculated disgust, and a contempt for weakness that went deeper than the implants and touched something fundamental in Khan's corrupted soul. He believed that the weakness of his fellow traitors was the reason they had lost the Heresy. The weakness of the other legions, yes, but also the weakness within the World Eaters themselves. They had been handed the greatest prize in the galaxy, the chance to storm the Imperial Palace and tear the Emperor from his golden throne. And they had failed, not because they were not strong enough, but because they had not been willing enough, because at the critical moment, they had hesitated, they had stopped. Khan grabbed a flamer, and then he went to work. Moving through the ruins of the World Eaters' shelters, Khan turned his weapon on his own brothers. He burned them from cover, and driving them out into the killing cold with gouts of chemical flame. When World Eaters attempted to stop him, he cut them down with Gorechild. When Emperor's children tried to take advantage of the chaos, he killed them too. He was indiscriminate. He was unstoppable. He was the wrath of Khorne given form, and nothing in his path, friend or foe, loyalist or traitor, was spared. The fires Khan started spread rapidly through the ruined city, consuming the remaining shelters and forcing both the World Eaters and the Emperor's children out into the open. With the number of intact buildings dwindling and the cold deepening with every passing minute, the two legions had no choice but to fight each other for control of the remaining shelters. What had been an organized military engagement dissolved into a free-for-all of desperate, savage violence. World Eaters and Emperor's children clawing at each other in the flickering light of burning ruins, while the temperature dropped to levels that could kill even a transhuman warrior. By the time the nightmare of Scalithrax's night finally passed, both legions were shattered. The World Eaters, already strained by years of infighting and the constant degradation of the butcher's nails, had been broken into dozens of scattered warbands. The Emperor's children had fared little better. Neither legion would ever truly reunite. The World Eaters, in particular, were condemned to exist as a collection of independent warbands for the next 10,000 years, united only by their shared devotion to Khorne and the lingering genetic bond of their Primarch's blood. The impact of Scalithrax on the broader galaxy cannot be overstated. Before that night, the World Eaters had been a damaged but potentially recoverable military force. They were scattered, yes, and their discipline had been shattered by the nails and the influence of Khorne, but they were still a legion in the technical sense, still a coherent body of warriors who shared a common identity and common purpose. After Scalithrax, they were fragments, shards of a broken mirror, each one reflecting the same image of blood and fury, but none of them connected to the others. The warbands that formed in the aftermath ranged from tiny squads of half a dozen berserkers to enormous hosts of several thousand, but they were all, without exception, independent. They made their own decisions about where to fight, whom to fight, and how to fight. This fragmentation, paradoxically, made the World Eaters more dangerous rather than less. A unified legion can be located, tracked, engaged, and defeated through conventional military means. 1,000 independent warbands, each one operating according to its own unpredictable logic, each one appearing from the warp without warning and disappearing again just as quickly, is a threat that cannot be eliminated through any strategy the Imperium has yet devised. Cut off one warband, and 3 more appear, drawn to the scent of blood and the promise of slaughter. The Imperium has never developed an effective counter to the World Eaters precisely because there is no central authority to negotiate with, no strategic center of gravity to target, no supply chain to interdict. Each warband is a self-sustaining engine of destruction, of feeding on plunder and the supernatural sustenance of the blood god's favor, capable of continuing its bloody crusade indefinitely. Khan earned his title that night, the Betrayer. It was not the Imperium that named him this, not the loyalists he had fought against for so long. It was his own brothers, the World Eaters, the warriors who had trusted him to lead them to a new home and had instead been burned from their shelters and driven into the cold to fight and die. Khan himself did not seem to care about the title or the hatred it represented. He had served Khorne. He had spilled blood. That was all that mattered. The blood god, watching from his throne of skulls, was pleased. Even as the World Eaters ceased to exist as a coherent military force, or even as 10,000 years of carefully cultivated martial tradition and hard-won experience were scattered to the winds like ash, Khorne was satisfied. The blood had flowed. The skulls had been taken. The details of who had killed whom and why were irrelevant. Only the killing mattered. For nearly 10 millennia after the Battle of Scalithrax, the World Eaters existed not as a legion, but as a constellation of warbands, each led by its own champion or Chaos Lord, each pursuing its own bloody path through the galaxy. Some of these warbands were small, barely a dozen warriors strong, roaming the Eye of Terror in search of enemies to fight and blood to spill. Others were larger, hundreds or even thousands of berserkers, united under the banner of a particularly powerful or charismatic champion, as capable of launching raids that could threaten entire sectors of Imperial space. The berserker warbands operated according to a simple and brutal logic. They went where the fighting was. They did not care about strategy or territory or long-term objectives. They cared about one thing: the opportunity to kill. A berserker warband would join any conflict, on any side, if it offered the promise of sufficient bloodshed. They fought alongside other Chaos forces during the Black Crusades, launched by Abaddon, the Despoiler. They fought against them when no other enemies were available. They fought Xenos races, Imperial forces, other Chaos warbands, and occasionally each other. The only constant was the killing. The only loyalty was to Khorne. During these millennia, the practices of the World Eaters spread to other Chaos Space Marines, or as the bastardized techniques of berserker surgery, the crude replications of the butcher's nails that Angron's apothecaries had perfected during the Great Crusade, found their way into the hands of other traitor legions and renegade chapters. Abaddon the Despoiler was particularly active in recruiting berserker surgeons to serve the Black Legion, recognizing the military value of warriors who felt no fear, no pain, and no desire except to close with the enemy and tear them apart. While the Black Legion's berserker surgeons were never quite as skilled as the World Eaters' original apothecaries, they were competent enough to produce a steady stream of new berserkers, warriors who had undergone the same crude lobotomization and emerged as frothing engines of carnage dedicated to the blood god. Not all berserkers were World Eaters, but this is an important point that often gets lost in the broader narrative. While the World Eaters were the original berserkers, the template from which all others were drawn, Chaos Space Marines from any legion or chapter could dedicate themselves to Khorne and undergo the process that would transform them into berserkers. Some did so willingly, drawn by the promise of power and the simple clarity of Khorne's doctrine. Others were forced into it by the champions of warbands who needed expendable shock troops and were not particular about consent. The result was the same. Warriors stripped of everything except the desire to kill, their minds scoured clean by pain and rage, their bodies hardened by the gifts of the blood god into weapons that could shrug off wounds that would kill a normal space marine. The greatest of these berserker champions, the ones who survived long enough to accumulate the favor of Horn through centuries or millennia of continuous slaughter, could become truly terrifying. They grew larger, stronger, more resistant to damage. Their reflexes sharpened to superhuman levels. Their senses became attuned to the presence of blood and the scent of fear. Some received physical mutations from their god, their bodies twisted into forms that were more weapon than flesh, their hands becoming claws, their skin hardening into something approaching natural armor. A few, the most favored and the most deadly, ascended to become demon princes themselves, immortal champions of the blood god who could lead entire armies of the damned. But for every champion who rose to glory, there were thousands of anonymous berserkers who lived and died in obscurity, their skulls added to Khorne's mountain without ceremony or remembrance. This was the reality of life as a berserker. Not glory, not honor, not the kind of martial legend that the World Eaters had once aspired to. Just killing. Endless, purposeless, indiscriminate killing, world after world, century after century, until the body finally wore out, or a lucky shot from an enemy weapon ended the cycle. And then, approximately 10,000 years after the Heresy, something happened that united the scattered warbands of the World Eaters for the first time since Scalithrax. Angron came back. The first war for Armageddon, fought in the year 444 of the 41st millennium, is perhaps the least known of the three great wars that have been waged on that embattled hive world. This is deliberate. The Inquisition, the secretive organization tasked with protecting the Imperium from the threats of the warp, went to extraordinary lengths to suppress all knowledge of the conflict, erasing it from public records and imprisoning or executing anyone who spoke of what had happened. Even the inhabitants of Armageddon themselves were kept in ignorance, told that only 2 wars had been fought for their world rather than 3. The reason for this secrecy was simple. The first war for Armageddon was fought against the forces of chaos, led by a being whose very existence was supposed to be impossible. A demon primarch, one of the traitor sons of the Emperor, returned from the warp in physical form to wage war upon the Imperium. The authorities could not allow the general population to know that such things existed, that the horrors of the Horus Heresy were not safely contained in the distant past, but could return at any moment to threaten the present. Angron had spent much of the 10,000 years since the Heresy attempting to restore some level of unity among the scattered warbands of his World Eaters. As a demon prince, his existence was tied to the warp, and maintaining a physical presence in real space required enormous expenditures of psychic energy that even a being of Angron's power could only sustain for limited periods. But the blood god was patient, and his champion was determined. Slowly, over the course of millennia, Angron gathered the disparate warbands of the World Eaters together, drawing them to his banner through the sheer magnetic pull of his demonic presence and the promise of unprecedented slaughter. The vehicle for Angron's invasion was a space hulk, a massive conglomeration of wrecked ships fused together by the chaotic energies of the warp, designated the Devourer of Stars. This enormous vessel, large enough to carry a huge army of chaos forces, emerged from the warp in the Armageddon system in 444M41. Its arrival preceded by the outbreak of chaos cults that had been seeded on the planet for years in preparation for the invasion. The timing was not of Angron's choosing. The capricious currents of the warp had delivered the invasion force to Armageddon seemingly at random, but the blood god did not deal in coincidences. Wherever blood could be spilled, Khorne ensured that his servants would find their way. The chaos army that poured from the Devourer of Stars was vast and terrible. World Eaters berserkers in blood-red armor, yet their chain axes screaming, led the assault. Behind them came cultists, demon hosts, mutants, beastmen, and hordes of demonic creatures summoned from the warp by the sheer concentration of cornate energy that surrounded Angron's host. Nearly half of Armageddon's planetary defense force defected to the invaders, corrupted by the chaos cults that had been working to undermine the planet's loyalty for years. The initial invasion was devastating. The chaos forces swept across Armageddon Prime, the northern continent, overwhelming the defenders with speed and savagery that left no time for organized resistance. Entire hive cities fell within days, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. The planetary governor proved completely unprepared for the attack, his piecemeal defenses swept aside by the tidal wave of berserkers and demons that crashed against them. Salvation came from an unexpected quarter. The Space Wolves, the sons of Lemon Russ, answered the distress call and deployed to Armageddon in force. The Great Wolf, Logan Grimnar himself, led the defense, his commanding presence rallying the terrified Imperial forces and giving them the backbone they desperately needed. Grimnar led an armored assault across the River Charon directly into the World Eater's horde, inflicting heavy casualties before withdrawing. The enraged World Eaters pursued the Space Wolves into the jungle, where they fell into a combined Space Wolf and Steel Legion ambush along the Charon and were slaughtered in their thousands. But the Space Wolves alone could not defeat a demon Primarch. For that, the Imperium needed its most closely guarded weapon, the Grey Knights. The Grey Knights were a secret chapter of Space Marines, unknown to the wider Imperium, created specifically to fight demonic threats. Every Grey Knight was a potent psyker, every one of them incorruptible, their very existence a weapon forged for moments exactly like this. The Grey Knights of the Third Brotherhood, commanded by Brother Captain Taramar Aurelian, teleported directly into the center of the Chaos Horde. 109 Grey Knights, surrounded by thousands of berserkers and demons, fighting their way toward the towering form of Angron himself. The casualties were immediate and horrific. Angron was a demon Primarch, a being of almost limitless power, and even Grey Knights fell before him like wheat before the scythe. Squad after squad was destroyed, their psychically charged weapons barely scratching the demonic colossus who raged through their ranks. It was a young Grey Knight named Hyperion who turned the tide. In a tremendous display of faith and psychic power, Hyperion shattered Angron's demonic sword, the hideous cornate relic known as the Black Blade. The effort was so great that Hyperion collapsed into unconsciousness, his body broken by the sheer expenditure of psychic energy required to destroy a weapon forged in the fires of the blood god's own domain. But the deed was done. Angron was disarmed, and Brother Captain Aurelian was able to confront the weakened demon Primarch, and, at the cost of his own life, banish Angron back to the warp. The banishment was not permanent. Horn's champions cannot truly be killed in the material world, only temporarily expelled. But it would be 100 Terran years before Angron could manifest again in real space, and in his absence, the Chaos invasion collapsed. The remaining cultists were crushed by the Imperial counterattack, and Armageddon was, for the moment, saved. Of the 109 Grey Knights who had teleported into the heart of the demonic horde, only 13 survived. The cost of victory against a single demon Primarch and his berserker host had been staggering, and the Inquisition moved quickly to ensure that no record of the battle would reach the ears of a public that could not be allowed to know the scale of the threat that had faced them. The surviving population of Armageddon was rounded up and subjected to intense screening by the Inquisition. Those who had witnessed the demonic invasion firsthand were sterilized and worked to death in labor camps, now their knowledge dying with them. An entire world's memory was erased, replaced by a sanitized history that acknowledged only 2 wars for Armageddon rather than 3. The First War became a secret, locked away in the most classified archives of the Imperium, known only to the highest echelons of the Inquisition and the Grey Knights themselves. But the berserkers who had fought on Armageddon did not care about secrecy or history. They had served Khorne. They had spilled blood
on a scale that would please the blood god for years to come. And they would do it again, as they had always done, as they would always do, because that was all they were now, weapons in the service of a god who could never be satisfied. In the 41st millennium and beyond, the Berserkers of Khorne remain one of the most feared and destructive forces in the galaxy. The World Eaters, though shattered as a unified legion for 10,000 years, continue to produce warbands of staggering violence, each one a self-contained engine of destruction that can appear without warning, wreak havoc on entire systems, and disappear back into the warp before a coordinated response can be mounted. Kharn the Betrayer remains the greatest of Khorne's mortal champions, a living legend whose name is spoken with a mixture of awe and terror by friend and foe alike. In the 10,000 years since Scalithrax, Kharn has carved a bloody path across the galaxy that defies comprehension. His kill count is a number so vast that it has long since ceased to have any meaningful context. It is whispered that beside the blood god's throne there is a pile of skulls reserved solely for Kharn's offerings, and a pile that grows higher with every passing day. During the 13th Black Crusade, Kharn was unleashed upon the defenders of Cadia, the fortress world that guarded the only stable route out of the Eye of Terror. He led his butcher horde against the Blood Angels, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and Imperial Titans on the planet of Amathul during the Diamor campaign, demonstrating once again that there is no military force in the galaxy that can reliably stop a berserker assault led by the blood god's chosen champion. After the opening of the Great Rift, the massive warp storm that tore the galaxy in half at the end of the 41st millennium, Kharn sensed the presence of Saint Celestine, the living saint of the Adepta Sororitas, on the planet of Tzadreka. The betrayer went hunting, so carving a path through Imperial defenses that included the Imperial Fists, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the Sisters of Battle. In a duel that would fulfill a prophecy that both combatants had fervently aspired to, Kharn managed to behead Saint Celestine, adding the skull of one of the Imperium's most revered figures to his already incomprehensible tally. Only the bravest or most desperate Chaos warlords dare to summon Kharn to their service, because his loyalty is as unpredictable as his bloodlust. His axe has often tasted the blood of those who summon him, especially if they no longer prove worthy of his efforts, or if no enemies remain for him to slaughter. Kharn fights for no one except Khorne and himself, and the distinction between those two loyalties has long since ceased to matter. What the opening of the Great Rift has been a watershed moment for the Berserkers of Khorne. The massive tear in reality that now bisects the galaxy has allowed the forces of chaos unprecedented access to the material universe, and the Blood God's servants have taken full advantage. A massive formation known as the Blood Crusade, a vast legion of Khorne's demons, poured into real space and descended upon world after world, including Armageddon, which found itself facing a demonic invasion for the second time. The planet became a three-way battleground, with Imperial forces, Orc warbands, and Khornate forces all fighting each other in an apocalyptic conflict that shows no signs of ending. Angron himself has returned to the material universe in the era following the Great Rift. The Demon Primarch led a devastating campaign during the Arcs of Omen conflict, demonstrating a degree of tactical lucidity that was unusual for a being supposedly consumed by mindless rage. During the battle for the world of Malakbaal, Angron divided his forces into three great pincers, a maneuver that required strategic thinking far beyond what anyone had expected from the Lord of the World Eaters. He reached the planet's coral engine, a device of tremendous psychic significance, and there faced some 60 Grey Knights and Tempestus Scions. Despite being badly wounded, Angron and his 8 bloodthirster honor guards proved nearly unstoppable, slaughtering all who stood against them. The Blood God used Angron as a conduit to destroy the coral engine, sending out a psychic shockwave known as the Murder Curse that corrupted nearly all of Indomitus' Crusade fleet quarters. Later, during the Battle of Idolatros, Angron was summoned by World Eaters
allied to the demon entity Vashtor. The demon Primarch fought against the Blood Angels and even defeated Chapter Master Dante in single combat, though the intervention of the returned Primarch Lion L. Johnson prevented him from finishing the kill. These events demonstrate that the Berserkers of Khorne are not merely a relic of the Horus Heresy, a spent force living on borrowed time in the Eye of Terror. They are an active, evolving, and increasingly dangerous threat to the Imperium and to every other faction in the galaxy. The Great Rift has given them new avenues of attack, new worlds to despoil, and new enemies to fight. And with Angron active once more in real space, the possibility exists that the scattered warbands of the World Eaters might one day be reunited under their demon Primarch's banner, forming a force of destruction that the galaxy has not seen since the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. The Berserker warbands of the present day reflect the full spectrum of Khornate devotion. Some are small, intimate bands of murderers who roam the warp like predators, emerging into real space to prey on vulnerable targets before vanishing again. Others are vast armies capable of threatening entire sectors, led by Chaos Lords or Demon Princes who have accumulated the favor of Khorne over millennia of unbroken slaughter. Among the most notable are the Skull Takers of Hans Korin, who proved the superiority of Khorne over Slaanesh by exterminating an entire warband of Noise Marines in their own pleasure den. There is also the headsman of Celebos, a mysterious world eater whose identity remains unknown, who wields a massive two-handed chain axe with which he beheads his foes, often a dozen with a single sweep. And then there are the countless unnamed warbands, unremarkable in the grand sweep of galactic history, but no less deadly to the worlds that have the misfortune to fall in their path. Each of these warbands maintains its own traditions, its own internal hierarchy, and its own approach to the business of slaughter. But they all share certain fundamental characteristics. They all favor melee combat above all other forms of warfare, viewing the use of ranged weapons as, at best, a necessary evil and at worst an insult to the blood god. They all carry chain axes, the favored weapon of Khorne, though chainswords, ritual knives, and other brutal close-quarters weapons are also common. They all wear the blood red and brass of their patron god, their ancient power armor scarred and dented by millennia of continuous warfare. And they all, without exception, live for one thing and one thing only, the next fight. So what does it truly mean to be a berserker? Not the glory of it, not the power or the favor of a dark god, or the adrenaline rush of charging across a battlefield with a chain axe in your hand. What does it actually mean, in practical terms, to be a being that was once a space marine, once a warrior of extraordinary skill and discipline, and has been reduced to something that exists solely for the purpose of killing? It means pain. That is the first and most fundamental truth of a berserker's existence. The butcher's nails are always there, always buzzing, always biting. In moments of relative calm, when the fighting has stopped and there are no enemies within reach, the nails inflict a constant, grinding agony that makes it impossible to rest, to think clearly, or to experience anything resembling peace. The berserker paces. He snarls. He lashes out at shadows and sounds and the movements of his own brothers. The only thing that keeps him from tearing his own helmet apart is the knowledge, implanted at the deepest level of his restructured psyche, that there will be another fight soon. There is always another fight. It means isolation. But berserkers cannot form meaningful relationships with anyone, including each other. The nails have destroyed the neural architecture that makes empathy and attachment possible, leaving only the crude bonds of pack behavior and the mutual recognition that this particular group of killers has not yet turned on each other. Berserker warbands are held together not by loyalty or friendship, but by the practical calculation that fighting alongside others increases the chances of finding more enemies to kill. When a berserker falls in combat, his brothers do not mourn him. They step over his body and keep fighting. If his weapons are still functional, someone will pick them up. His name will not be remembered. His deeds will not be celebrated. He will simply be gone. Or another anonymous skull on a mountain that stretches beyond the limits of imagination. It means hunger, not for food or water,
or any of the physical necessities that a Space Marine's enhanced physiology has long since reduced to minor concerns, but for the one thing that the nails will not allow a berserker to live without: violence. The hunger is always there, a gnawing emptiness that grows more desperate with every moment of inactivity. It is the dark mirror of addiction, a dependency that was not chosen but imposed, hardwired into the berserker's brain by the crude surgery of the butcher's nails. A berserker who is denied combat for too long becomes dangerous even by the standards of his own kind, a feral thing that will attack anything that moves, regardless of faction or allegiance, simply to feed the need that the nails have made the center of his existence. And it means losing yourself. This is perhaps the most terrible aspect of all. Over time, the nails erode everything that once made a berserker who he was. Memories fade, personality dissolves. The name he was given when he was inducted into his legion or chapter becomes a meaningless collection of syllables, sounds that belong to someone who no longer exists. The tactical knowledge, the combat experience, the skills and instincts accumulated over decades or centuries of warfare, all of it is gradually consumed by the nails until nothing remains except the raw, animal drive to fight and kill. There are berserkers who have been killing for 10,000 years. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 years of continuous slaughter, punctuated by periods of agonized waiting in the warp or in the holds of strike cruisers, their minds slowly crumbling under the relentless pressure of the nails. What is left of the man who was originally implanted? What fragment of the warrior who once swore oaths to the Emperor, who once stood beside brothers he loved and fought for a cause he believed in, survives in the screaming, blood-soaked thing that charges across battlefields in the 41st millennium? Nothing. That is the answer that the lore of Warhammer 40,000 suggests, and it is an answer that carries a weight of tragedy that is often lost beneath the surface spectacle of chain axes and chain blades and rivers of blood. The Berserkers of Khorne are not villains in the conventional sense. They are victims, every single one of them. They are victims of a broken Primarch who inflicted his own torment upon his sons, victims of implants that were designed by slavers to strip away everything that made a being human, victims of a god who promises only the cold comfort of perpetual rage and the hollow satisfaction of one more skull added to a mountain that can never be high enough. The tragedy of the Berserkers is the tragedy of the World Eaters writ large. It is the story of men who were made into monsters by the very institutions that should have protected them. The Emperor created the Primarchs. He created the Space Marines. He unleashed the Great Crusade. And when things went wrong, when his sons fell and his legions turned against him, that the blame did not belong to any single actor, but to the entire system that had been built on the assumption that superhuman warriors could be created, controlled, and discarded without consequence. Angron was a slave who was freed only to be enslaved again. His sons were warriors who were given implants that destroyed everything that made them warriors. Khan was a captain, a tactician, a thinker, reduced by the nails and the warp to a killing machine who can no longer remember why he started killing in the first place. These are not stories of glory. They are stories of ruin, of potential squandered, and lives wasted in the service of a hunger that can never be satisfied. And yet, in the grim darkness of the far future, the Berserkers endure. They endure because the galaxy provides an endless supply of enemies to fight and blood to spill. And they endure because the butcher's nails will not let them stop. They endure because Khorne, sitting upon his throne of skulls at the heart of the warp, demands their service and rewards their devotion with the only currency he has to offer: more war. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. The words are a battle cry, a prayer, a summation of an entire philosophy of existence condensed into 8 syllables. They are the first words a berserker learns, and the last words he speaks before his chain axe bites into enemy flesh. They are the gospel of Khorne, the creed of the damned, and the promise that the killing will never, ever stop, because it will not. Not as long as there is blood left to spill. Not as long as there are skulls left to take. Not as long as the warp echoes with the rage of a god who was born from violence and will only be satisfied when the last living thing in the universe has fallen beneath the axes of his servants. The Berserkers are coming. They have always been coming. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there is nothing at all, that can stand before them for long. But if we truly want to understand the Berserkers, if we want to comprehend what they are rather than merely what they do, we need to look deeper than battlefields and casualty reports. We need to look inside the armor, inside the skull, inside the shattered remnants of the mind that still flickers behind those hate-filled eyes. Because the true story of the Berserker is not told in the aftermath of a charge or in the counting of skulls. It is told in the quiet spaces, in the moments between wars, in the slow and terrible process by which a man becomes something else entirely. There is a moment in every Berserker's existence, though he may not recognize it for what it is, when the last thread connecting him to the person he used to be finally snaps. It does not happen all at once. It is not a dramatic event, not a thunderbolt from the heavens or a roaring voice from the warp declaring that the transformation is complete. It happens quietly, in the spaces between battles, in the dark holds of warships that stink of blood and recycled air. A Berserker reaches for a memory, something from before the nails, before the heresy, before everything went wrong, and finds nothing there, just static. Just the buzzing of the implants and the dull ache that tells him it has been too long since his last kill. What that moment is the death of the man and the birth of the weapon. Consider for a moment the experience of a world eater before the fall, during those early years of the Great Crusade, when the 12th Legion was still the Warhounds. These were not mindless brutes. They were space marines, warriors who had undergone some of the most extensive training and biological enhancement procedures in human history. They could speak multiple languages. They could read tactical displays and calculate firing solutions in their heads. They could compose poetry, though few chose to. They could remember the names and faces of their brothers, the particular sound of each one's voice, the way a certain squad leader tilted his head when he was about to give an order. They had interior lives, these men. They had preferences, opinions, our private jokes and quiet rivalries. They were people. The butcher's nails took all of that away, not immediately, but inevitably. Like water wearing away stone, the constant neural restructuring imposed by the implants eroded the complex cognitive architecture that made these warriors who they were. Higher functions degraded first. Abstract thinking became harder. The ability to plan beyond the immediate future, to consider consequences, to weigh options and make reasoned decisions, all of it faded like a dream upon waking. Then the emotional landscape simplified. The range of feelings that a human being, even an enhanced one, experiences on a daily basis: joy, curiosity, satisfaction, affection, amusement, melancholy, all of it collapsed into a narrow band of rage, pain, and the brief, desperate relief of violence. The memories went last. And their loss was perhaps the cruelest thing of all, because a berserker in the early stages of the nail's influence could remember what he was losing even as he lost it. He could feel the faces of his brothers growing blurry in his mind's eye, could sense the names of old campaigns fading like ink exposed to sunlight, could recognize that the tactical instincts he had spent decades honing were being overwritten by something simpler and more brutal. He knew what was happening to him, and he could not stop it. No one could. The nails did not ask permission. They simply did their work, day by day, hour by hour, synapse by synapse, until the man was gone, and only the weapon remained. This is the horror that lies at the heart of the berserker's story. Not the violence itself, though the violence is extraordinary, was not the blood or the skulls or the screaming charge across a battlefield that turns the ground to churned mud and broken bodies. The horror is in the quietness of the transformation, the way it happens in increments so small that each one seems insignificant, until the sum total of those insignificant losses adds up to the complete annihilation of a sentient being. A berserker does not choose to lose himself. He is consumed, gradually and irreversibly, by the very thing that was supposed to make him stronger. And once the transformation is complete, once the nails have done their work, and nothing remains of the original warrior except the muscle memory of combat and the deep brain imperative to kill, something strange happens. The berserker becomes, in a terrible way, peaceful. Not at rest, never at rest. The nails make rest impossible. But at peace with his purpose. The internal conflict is over. The grieving for lost memories, lost friendships, lost identity, all of that has been burned away, along with the capacity to feel grief in the first place. What remains is something clean, in the way that a blade is clean. Something pure, in the way that fire is pure. Something that exists for one purpose, and fulfills that purpose with an efficiency that verges on the beautiful, if you can stomach the beauty of a thing designed solely for destruction. This is what Khorne sees when he looks upon his berserkers. Not the blood and the fury that they project outward, though he relishes those things. He sees the purity of their devotion, the absolute clarity of their purpose, at the way they have been stripped of everything that might distract them from the singular act of worship that defines their existence. A berserker is the perfect follower of the blood god, because he is incapable of being anything else. Every other desire, every other loyalty, every other facet of his being has been carved away until nothing remains except the need to kill and the faith that killing pleases his god. It is a faith so total, so absolute, that it makes the most devout servant of the god emperor look like a casual believer by comparison. Let us talk about what happens when berserkers go to war, because the mechanics of a berserker assault are as fascinating as they are terrifying. Unlike most military forces in the 41st millennium, berserker warbands do not employ combined arms tactics in any meaningful sense, or they do not coordinate artillery barrages with infantry advances. They do not use air support to soften enemy positions before committing ground forces. They do not establish supply lines, set up forward operating bases, or conduct reconnaissance in force. All of these are activities that require planning, patience, and the ability to delay gratification, and the nails make every single one of them impossible. A berserker assault begins the moment the warp carries a warband's ship within striking distance of a target world. Drop pods are loaded, boarding torpedoes are armed, and the berserkers are released from whatever restraints, physical and chemical, have been keeping them quiescent during the journey. The sound of their awakening fills the ship from stem to stern, the grinding of teeth, the clanking of chain weapons being tested, the rhythmic pounding of armored fists against bulkheads as the nails begin to sing and the fury builds toward its inevitable release. The drop itself is a moment of almost transcendent horror for anyone on the receiving end. Drop pods scream through the atmosphere like burning meteors, their heat shields glowing white-hot as they punch through cloud cover and slam into the surface with impacts that register on seismic equipment halfway around the planet. The hatches blow open and the berserkers pour out, already screaming, their chain axes already revving, their bodies already in motion before their boots have fully settled on the ground. There is no formation, no fire and movement, no covering fire or bounding overwatch or any of the 1,000 tactical niceties that make a military force effective. There is just the charge. A wall of red and brass armor, teeth bared behind horned helmets, weapons raised, voices howling the name of the blood god in a cacophony that drowns out everything else. The ground shakes under their boots. The air ripples with the psychic resonance of concentrated cornate fury, a pressure wave of pure aggression that can cause weaker-willed defenders to break and run before the berserkers have even closed to melee range. Those who stand their ground fare only marginally better. Bolter fire sparks against power armor that has been blessed by the blood god and reinforced by 10,000 years of continuous repair and modification. Plasma rounds burn through ceramite, but the berserker keeps coming, his pain receptors either destroyed by the nails or overridden by the surge of combat euphoria that the implants produce. While las fire is almost useless against power-armored targets,
and the time it takes a defender to realize that his weapon is not going to stop. The screaming monster bearing down on him is usually the last coherent thought he ever has. The chain axe is the berserker's signature weapon, and its design reflects the philosophy of its wielders with brutal precision. It is not an elegant weapon. It is not designed for dueling or precision strikes, or the kind of martial artistry that characterizes the combat styles of more disciplined chapters. It is a motor-driven axe whose cutting edge is lined with monomolecular teeth that spin at thousands of revolutions per minute, creating a cutting surface that can chew through ceramite, plasteel, bone, and flesh with equal indifference. The sound it makes, a rising shriek that builds from a bass growl to a high-pitched scream as the teeth engage a target, has become one of the most feared sounds on any battlefield in the galaxy. A berserker wielding a chain axe fights with no regard for defense. He does not parry. He does not feint. He does not seek to create openings in his opponent's guard through clever footwork or misdirection. He swings the axe in great, sweeping arcs that are designed to cleave through whatever they contact: enemy weapons, enemy armor, enemy bodies, friendly combatants who have the misfortune to be standing too close. The technique, if it can be called a technique, is raw and primal and shockingly effective against enemies who expect their opponents to fight like rational beings. Some berserkers wield paired weapons, as a chain axe in one hand and a chainsword in the other, creating a whirlwind of cutting edges that can dismember multiple opponents in a single spinning assault. Others prefer the ornate eviscerator, a massive two-handed weapon that sacrifices speed for sheer destructive power, its toothed blade capable of bisecting a space marine in Terminator armor if the blow lands cleanly. Still others, the most far gone of all, fight with nothing but their armored fists, battering their enemies to death with ceramite-clad knuckles, because the nails have stripped them of even the basic cognitive function required to operate a powered weapon. Against dug-in defenders with heavy weapon support, berserker assaults should, by all the conventional wisdom of warfare, fail catastrophically. And a force that charges directly at prepared positions without ranged support or suppressive fire should be shot to pieces before it reaches the enemy line. And sometimes this is exactly what happens. Berserker warbands have been destroyed in their entirety by disciplined defenders who kept their nerve and poured fire into the charging masses until the last red-armored body hit the ground. But more often, they do not fail. More often, the berserkers reach the enemy line, and when they do, the battle is over. The reason for this is partly supernatural. Khorne protects his own, and the blessings of the blood god are not merely metaphorical. Berserkers who have earned the favor of Khorne seem to be able to shrug off wounds that should be fatal, to survive impacts that would reduce a normal space marine to pulp, and to keep fighting with injuries that defy medical explanation. Limbs are severed, and the berserker keeps swinging with the remaining arm. Torsos are opened by power weapon strikes, and the berserker keeps charging, his guts trailing behind him like obscene banners. Heads are caved in by thunderhammer blows, and the berserker keeps fighting for seconds, sometimes minutes, before the body finally acknowledges what the brain has already conceded. The reason is also partly psychological. The berserker charge is an assault not just on the body, but on the mind. The sight of a wall of screaming, blood-soaked maniacs bearing down on you at full sprint, impervious to pain and indifferent to casualties, is enough to break the morale of warriors who have faced every other horror the galaxy can throw at them. Experienced guardsmen who have held the line against orc charges and tyrannid swarms have been known to break and run at the sight of Khorne berserkers in full charge, because there is something fundamentally different about facing an enemy that is not trying to defeat you strategically, but is simply trying to reach you, so it can tear you apart with its bare hands. And the reason is partly tactical, though no berserker would recognize it as such. The very simplicity of the berserker assault, its lack of subtlety, its complete absence of anything resembling a plan, can paradoxically make it very difficult to counter. A sophisticated military force facing a sophisticated enemy can develop counter-strategies, anticipate maneuvers, exploit weaknesses in the enemy's doctrine. But there is no weakness to exploit in a force that does not have a doctrine.
There is no plan to anticipate when the enemy's plan consists entirely of running straight at you and hitting you with an axe. Defenders, who have been trained to fight thinking opponents, find themselves wrong-footed by opponents who have stopped thinking entirely. The aftermath of a berserker assault is a scene that would be familiar to the chroniclers of any age of human warfare, because the raw material of the aftermath, blood and bodies, and the scattered debris of violent death, has been the same since the first primitive wielded a sharpened rock against his neighbor. The difference is one of scale. A berserker assault on a defended position typically results in the complete destruction of everything and everyone within the target area. Well, there are no prisoners, there are no survivors, there are no wounded left to be evacuated to field hospitals. There are only bodies, stacked in heaps that sometimes reach head height, their skulls removed with surgical precision, even as the berserkers continue their advance toward the next target, the next kill, the next offering to the god who sits upon his mountain of bone. Those skulls are important. They are not merely trophies, though they serve that function as well. Each skull removed from a fallen enemy is a sacrament, a physical token of devotion to Khorne that carries genuine spiritual significance within the twisted theology of the blood god's worship. The act of taking a skull, of cutting through neck and sinew and spinal cord to separate the cranium from the body, is the closest thing a berserker has to prayer. It is the moment when the violence transcends mere combat and becomes worship, when the killer acknowledges that the blood he has spilled was not spilled for himself, but for his god. Berserkers are often depicted festooned with skulls, dangling from chains and hooks attached to their armor, and this is not artistic exaggeration. A veteran berserker may carry dozens of skulls into battle, the accumulated offerings of hundreds of engagements rattling against his armor as he runs, each one a record of a life taken and a prayer offered. The weight is considerable, but the berserker does not notice it. The nails have long since overridden any sensation of fatigue or discomfort that does not contribute directly to the act of killing. There is one more aspect of the berserker phenomenon that demands attention, and that is the question of what the berserkers represent in the broader context of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Because the berserkers are not merely a threat to be countered on the battlefield, they are a symbol, a warning, a dark mirror held up to the face of the Imperium itself. Consider this. The Emperor created the Space Marines to be weapons. He designed them, engineered them, trained them, and deployed them with the explicit understanding that they were instruments of war rather than fully autonomous beings with the right to determine their own destinies. The Primarchs were generals, yes, but they were also prototypes, test cases for the technology of genetic enhancement that the Emperor intended to use to create an army of superhuman soldiers. But the Space Marines themselves were not asked whether they wanted to be transformed into post-human killing machines. They were selected, often as children, and subjected to a process that remade their bodies and minds in ways that could never be reversed. The Berserkers are what happens when this process is taken to its logical extreme. If the purpose of a Space Marine is to fight, then the butcher's nails simply remove everything that is not fighting. If the purpose of a warrior is to kill, then the nails strip away everything that is not killing. The Berserkers are the Emperor's creation, pushed past all safeguards and limitations, the final expression of a philosophy that treats human beings as raw material to be shaped into weapons. They are what Space Marines become when the pretense of humanity is abandoned and the truth of their purpose is embraced without reservation. This is why the Berserkers are so frightening, not just to the characters within the lore, but to us as readers and fans of the setting. They remind us that the Imperium, for all its Gothic grandeur and its rhetoric of sacrifice and duty, is built on a foundation of dehumanization. The Emperor did not create warriors. He created weapons that looked like warriors. And when those weapons fell into the hands of a darker power, when the Chaos Gods offered them an alternative to the Emperor's cold pragmatism, the result was not a corruption of purpose, but a clarification of it. The Berserkers know what they are. They are killers. They have always been killers.
or as the only thing that has changed is the name of the god they kill for. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of the World Eaters' story. Not that they fell to chaos, though that is tragic enough. Not that they were broken by the butcher's nails, though the nails are an abomination. The deepest tragedy is that the difference between a loyal space marine and a Khorne berserker is smaller than anyone in the Imperium would like to admit. The berserkers are not aliens or demons or creatures from beyond the veil of reality. They are the Emperor's sons, wearing the Emperor's armor, using the Emperor's genetic enhancements to do the Emperor's work, killing. The only thing that separates them from their loyalist counterparts is the name on their banner and the color of their armor. Blood for the blood god, the berserkers cry. And somewhere in the depths of the Imperial Palace, the golden throne hums with the psychic energy of a being who has consumed the souls of 1,000 psychers every day for 10,000 years. And the distinction between the two forms of worship becomes uncomfortably thin. The Dominion of Fire stands as one of the most devastating campaigns ever conducted by the World Eaters in their fractured, post-Scalithrax existence. It represents a moment of terrible clarity in the long, blood-drenched history of the 12th Legion, a proof of concept that demonstrated what the World Eaters could still accomplish even after 10,000 years of fragmentation, degradation, and the slow grinding erosion of the butcher's nails. It was also a reminder to the Imperium that the threats of the Horus Heresy were not safely contained in the past. Thus, that the traitors who had once nearly toppled the Emperor from his golden throne were still out there, still hungry, still capable of unleashing destruction on a scale that could threaten entire segmentums. It was during this campaign that the demon Primarch Angron managed to gather approximately 50,000 World Eaters, the largest such gathering since the night Khan shattered the Legion. This was not a feat of diplomacy or persuasion. Angron did not send envoys or negotiate alliances. He simply appeared, a towering avatar of the blood god's wrath, and the scattered warbands came to him like iron filings drawn to a magnet. His presence in the warp was a beacon of rage that could be felt across the eye of terror, and every berserker who sensed it knew, with the certainty that only the nails can provide, that something magnificent and terrible was about to happen. The Dominion of Fire was a rampage across Imperial space that captured over 70 sectors in 2 centuries of continuous warfare. 70 sectors, each one a region of space encompassing multiple star systems and billions of inhabitants. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. Entire civilizations were erased. Worlds that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to charnel houses. The populations of hive cities that numbered in the hundreds of millions were slaughtered to the last child, their skulls added to the growing mountain that sustained their killer's patron god. The Imperium's response was slow, as it always is when facing threats that emerge from the Eye of Terror. The bureaucracy of the Adeptus Terra, that vast and creaking machinery of government that administers 1 million worlds across the galaxy, was not designed to respond quickly to anything. By the time the scale of the Dominion of Fire was fully appreciated, Angron's host had already burned its way through dozens of sectors, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would take generations to repair. When the response finally came, it was overwhelming. The Imperium gathered Baneblades, Space Marine chapters, and entire Titan legions for the counteroffensive. The campaign to reclaim the lost territories took 3 millennia, 3,000 years to undo 2 centuries of berserker rampage. And even then, the Imperium only managed to recover roughly 90% of the lost sectors. The remaining 10% were simply written off, but abandoned to whatever horrors the World Eaters had left behind. This campaign illustrates something fundamental about the berserker threat. The World Eaters, even scattered into warbands, even devoid of strategic thinking or long-term planning, are capable of causing destruction on a scale that dwarfs many of the galaxy's other major threats. They do not need supply lines. They do not need industrial support. They do not need anything except enemies to kill and the warp to carry them from one battlefield to the next. A berserker warband can sustain itself indefinitely through plunder and the supernatural sustenance provided by the blood god's favor, making them a threat that can never be truly eliminated.
only temporarily suppressed. As we near the end of this long and bloody journey through the history of the Berserkers, and it is worth asking one final question. Is there anything human left inside a Khorne Berserker? After 10,000 years of the nails, after 10,000 years of killing and rage and the slow erosion of everything that once made them who they were, is there still a person in there, trapped behind the screaming and the fury and the chain axe's howl? The lore of Warhammer 40,000 suggests that the answer is complicated. Kharn the Betrayer, the greatest of all mortal champions of Khorne, has been described by those who know him as possessing a dark intelligence and cunning that goes far beyond what the nails should allow. He is not mindless. He is not a rabid animal. He is something far more dangerous, a supremely skilled warrior who has learned to ride the fury of the nails rather than being swept away by it. Kharn thinks, he plans, and he makes decisions that demonstrate an awareness of tactical reality that should be impossible for someone whose brain has been restructured by berserker implants for 10,000 years. Whether this is because Kharn is simply that exceptional, a Primarch-forged warrior whose fundamental nature resists even the nails' relentless degradation, or because Khorne himself has preserved Kharn's faculties as a reward for his unmatched service, is a matter of debate. What is not debatable is that Kharn represents an outlier, a data point that does not fit the general pattern of berserker devolution. For every Kharn, there are thousands of anonymous berserkers who have long since lost any capacity for thought beyond the immediately tactical. They fight, they kill, they take skulls. They do not wonder why. And yet, there are moments, scattered throughout the lore like bloodstains on white marble, where something stirs in the depths of a berserker's ruined mind. A world eater will pause over the body of a fallen enemy, and, for just a second, his chain axe will go still. A berserker will stare at the face of a loyalist space marine and feel a flicker of something that is not rage, something that might be recognition, or sorrow, or the ghost of a memory too deeply buried to reach the surface. These moments are fleeting and rare, and they are always followed by a renewed surge of fury as the nails reassert their dominance. But they happen. They happen often enough to suggest that somewhere, in the deepest recesses of a berserker's restructured brain, something remembers what it was like to be human. Whether that something constitutes a soul, a conscience, a self, or merely a neurological artifact of a transformation that was never quite complete, is a question that the lore wisely leaves unanswered. The ambiguity is the point, because if there is nothing human left inside a berserker, then the berserkers are simply monsters, and monsters can be killed without remorse. But if there is something still in there, something that watches from behind eyes that burn with borrowed fury, something that remembers the sound of laughter and the warmth of brotherhood, and the quiet satisfaction of a duty well done, then the berserkers are not just enemies to be destroyed. They are tragedies to be mourned. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no one left to mourn them. The Conqueror, that ancient Gloriana-class battleship that served as the flagship of Angron and the 12th Legion, has taken on a life of its own in the millennia since the Heresy. The ship, once crewed by thousands of mortal serfs and servitors who kept its massive engines running and its weapons systems operational, has become something else entirely. Its corridors echo with the sound of distant screaming. Its walls are slick with blood that seeps from the very bulkheads, as if the ship itself has absorbed so much violence over the millennia that it has become saturated with it. The mortal crew are long gone, replaced by things that were once human but have been transformed by their proximity to the warp and the blood god's influence into something that defies easy categorization. The Conqueror still fights. It still travels the warp, guided by currents of rage and the will of its master. It has appeared over battlefields throughout the galaxy, while always where the fighting is thickest, always where the blood is flowing most freely. The continued fighting on Armageddon eventually attracted the damned vessel, which arrived at the beleaguered planet at the head of a vast, cornate host. The ship is as much a symbol of the World Eater's eternal war as any berserker champion. It is a weapon that carries weapons, a vessel of rage that sails a sea of fury, and it will continue to ply the stars until the last war is fought and the last skull is taken. The story of the Berserkers is, in many ways, the story of Warhammer 40,000 itself. It is a story about the cost of war, about the price that is paid when violence becomes not a means to an end, but an end in itself. It is a story about what happens when the institutions that are supposed to protect people instead consume them, when the weapons that are built to defend civilization become the instruments of its destruction. It is a story about rage, yes, about blood and skulls and the screaming charge across no man's land that turns the living into the dead. But it is also a story about loss, about the things that are sacrificed in the name of victory, the humanity that is traded for power, the souls that are surrendered to gods who promise glory and deliver only more war. The Berserkers do not know any of this. They cannot. The nails have taken their capacity for self-reflection along with everything else. They charge and they kill, and they take skulls and they scream the name of their god. And if there is a tragedy in their existence, it is one that only others can appreciate. The Berserkers themselves feel nothing but the nails and the fury and the brief, as ecstatic relief of combat. For them, there is no past and no future. There is only the eternal present of the battlefield, the chain axe's howl, the spray of blood, the satisfying crunch of a skull being separated from a spine. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. It is the simplest creed in the galaxy, and it is the most honest, because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The Berserkers have simply had the courtesy to stop pretending otherwise. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the Berserkers, the most brutal chaos warriors in all of Warhammer 40,000, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you are not already subscribed, go ahead and click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another video. I have got a lot more content like this in the works, exploring the darkest corners of the 40k universe and bringing the stories of the far future to life. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it flows.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.